Gay Elost Manuscript. The email from my stepmother arrived while I was grading freshman literature essays in my cramped office at Westfield Community College. Olivia, your father's estate is finally settled. The brownstone has sold. Harrison and I are dividing his personal effects this weekend. If there's anything specific you want, let me know by Friday. Otherwise, we'll assume you're not interested as usual. Victoria. I stared at the screen, the familiar mixture of grief and resentment churning in my stomach. My father had died 6 months ago, and this was the closest thing to a personal communication I'd received from Victoria since the funeral, where she'd introduced me to distant relatives as Robert's daughter from his first marriage. She teaches somewhere in Massachusetts. Not Dr. Olivia Blackwood, Associate Professor of Literature. Not published scholar of early American fiction. Just an afterthought, as I'd been for the 20 years since she'd married my father and given him Harrison, the son he'd always wanted. My name is Olivia Blackwood, 34, perpetually disappointing daughter of the renowned literary agent Robert Blackwood, who represented some of the most celebrated authors of the past 3 decades. I'd followed him into the world of literature, but not in the way he'd hoped. Instead of the prestigious publishing career he'd mapped out, I'd chosen academia, specifically the study of overlooked female writers of the early 19th century. Those obscure women scribblers he called my research focus at family dinners, writing domestic dramas that nobody remembered for a reason. I'd stopped attending those dinners after completing my doctorate. I typed a brief response to Victoria. I'd like to look through Dad's personal library and papers before anything is discarded. I can come Saturday morning. Her reply came almost immediately. Fine, 10 a.m. Harrison has already selected the valuable first editions for auction. Of course he had. My 26-year-old half-brother had followed perfectly in our father's footsteps, joining his literary agency straight out of his Ivy League education. He'd never read a book he couldn't monetize. That Saturday, I drove the 3 hours from western Massachusetts to my father's brownstone in Brooklyn. Now former brownstone, I reminded myself. The house where I'd grown up until my parents' divorce when I was 12 looked exactly as I remembered it. Imposing, elegant, filled with literary history. Victoria opened the door with an air kiss that didn't come within 6 inches of my cheek. Olivia, you look academic. I glanced down at my simple sweater and jeans. That would be because I am an academic. Harrison is in your father's study, cataloging. Most of the library has been boxed for donation, but you're welcome to look through it. She led me to the living room where dozens of cardboard boxes lined the walls. My heart sank as I realized I was looking at the dismantling of one of the finest private collections of American literature on the East Coast. You're donating all of this? There are probably rare editions. As I said, Victoria cut in. Harrison has already identified anything of actual value. The rest is just books. I bit back a response. To Victoria, my father's library had always been merely decorative, impressive shelving and leather bindings that complemented her interior design vision. That she couldn't tell the difference between a first edition Melville and a reading copy was something my father had found oddly charming. I'll start looking then. Don't take too long. The donation truck comes on Monday. Left alone, I began the overwhelming task of sifting through the box collection. Each carton I opened revealed more literary treasures. Not necessarily valuable in the monetary sense that would interest Harrison, but intellectually priceless. Annotated volumes with my father's distinctive marginalia, signed copies from authors he'd represented, books that had shaped American literary thought for generations. After an hour, Victoria appeared with coffee I hadn't asked for. Find anything worth keeping? The skepticism in her voice made clear she doubted I would. Actually, yes. I'd like to take these boxes. I gestured to several I'd set aside, containing works related to my research period and authors. She shrugged. Fine. Let me know when you're finished with your father's papers. Harrison needs to decide which client correspondence to retain for the agency archives. The study, my father's inner sanctum, was a wood-paneled room lined with built-in shelves that had once held his most prized literary possessions. Now it was half empty, with Harrison efficiently sorting through the remaining volumes and papers. The prodigal daughter returns, he said without looking up from his cataloging. Bit late, aren't you? Dad's been gone 6 months. Some of us don't have the luxury of dropping everything for extended bereavement leave, I replied. Community colleges aren't exactly generous with time off. Right, the noble pursuit of educating the masses. His tone made clear what he thought of my career choice. Well, don't get too comfortable. I've almost finished here. I looked around the room, memories flooding back. This was where I'd spent countless childhood hours, curled in the window seat with books while my father worked at his massive oak desk. It was where I'd first fallen in love with literature, long before it became a source of tension between us. What are you doing with his correspondence and manuscripts? I asked, noticing several bankers' boxes labeled client materials. Anything related to active clients comes to the agency. Personal correspondence goes to Victoria. The rest is trash. Trash? There could be important literary history in those papers. Harrison finally looked up, irritation clear on his face. If you're so concerned about literary history, maybe you should have shown more interest while Dad was alive. When was the last time you even spoke to him? His birthday? Christmas? The question stung because it contained a kernel of truth. Our relationship had been strained for years, our conversations perfunctory when they happened at all. But that didn't mean I hadn't cared. I like to look through his personal papers before anything is discarded, I said, ignoring his question. There may be materials relevant to my research. Your research on forgotten women writers nobody cares about. He rolled his eyes. Fine. Those boxes in the corner are headed for recycling. Knock yourself out, but anything you find related to his clients belongs to the agency. I spent the next several hours methodically sorting through decades of my father's notes, correspondence, and manuscripts. Most of it was mundane. Tax records, household files, correspondence with other agents and editors. Harrison periodically looked over my shoulder, making sure I wasn't pocketing anything of value to the agency. By late afternoon, with Victoria making increasingly unsubtle hints about needing to prepare for an evening engagement, I had filled my car with as many books and papers as it could hold. There was still so much to go through, but it would have to wait. I'll need to come back tomorrow, I told Victoria. That's not convenient. We have plans. Then I'll take more with me now and return what isn't relevant to my work. She sighed dramatically. Fine, but we need everything back or accounted for before the house closing next week. I loaded one final box into my trunk. A carton of mixed papers I hadn't had time to sort through properly, but that seemed to contain older material, possibly from before my father became a major agent. If nothing else, it would give me something to occupy my evening at the hotel. That night, sitting cross-legged on the hotel bed, I began sifting through the final box. Most of it was unremarkable, old contracts, letters from his early days in publishing, photographs from literary events in the 1980s and 90s. At the bottom of the box, however, I found something unexpected. A leather portfolio tied with faded ribbon, the kind used for manuscript submissions in the days before digital files. Inside was a typewritten manuscript titled Shadows of Salem by Elizabeth Gardner, dated 1988. I didn't recognize the author's name, but something about the manuscript intrigued me. The opening pages described a young woman in 1820s Massachusetts discovering her family's connection to the Salem witch trials. The prose was luminous, the historical details precise, the protagonist immediately compelling. I kept reading, unable to stop. Hours passed as I immersed myself in this unknown novel, the hotel room fading around me. By the time I reached the final page, dawn was breaking outside my window. The manuscript was extraordinary, a masterpiece of historical fiction that seamlessly blended actual events with a powerful narrative about women's autonomy, religious hypocrisy, and familial legacy. It was exactly the kind of work I studied in my research, yet I'd never heard of Elizabeth Gardner or this novel. More curious still, my father's notes were scrawled throughout the margins, enthusiastic comments that seemed completely at odds with his usual dismissal of women's fiction. On the final page he'd written, "Brilliant, revolutionary, will transform the genre." But if he'd thought so highly of it, why hadn't it been published? And who was Elizabeth Gardner? I searched online for any mention of the author or manuscript, but found nothing. The only Elizabeth Gardner who appeared in literary databases was an obscure poet who had published a single collection in the 1970s. The next morning, I arrived at the brownstone earlier than arranged, hoping for time to search for more information before Victoria and Harrison imposed their presence. To my surprise, Harrison was already in the study, efficiently filling a shredder with papers from one of the boxes I hadn't had time to examine. "What are you doing?" I demanded, horrified at the destruction of what might be important documents. Cleaning up, he replied without pausing. This is all ancient history from before Dad became successful. Nobody needs tax returns from 1985. I glanced at the papers feeding into the shredder. They weren't tax returns, they were letters, handwritten on personal stationery. Stop, those aren't financial records. Those are personal letters. From nobody important, he said dismissively. I checked. I reached past him and pulled a half-shredded letter from the machine. The signature was still visible. All I love, Elizabeth. My heart raced. Elizabeth Gardner. Harrison's expression changed subtly, a flicker of recognition quickly suppressed. Never heard of her. He was lying. I found her manuscript last night, I said, watching him carefully. Shadows of Salem. Dad thought it was brilliant. Why wasn't it published? No idea what you're talking about. He reached for the letter in my hand, but I pulled it away. You do know what happened to Elizabeth Gardner and her manuscript. Before he could respond, Victoria appeared in the doorway. What's going on? Why are you shouting? I held up the manuscript I brought with me. I found this last night, a novel by Elizabeth Gardner. Dad's notes suggest he thought it was extraordinary, but it was never published. I'm trying to understand why. Victoria's perfectly composed face went completely still. Where did you get that? In a box of Dad's old papers. Who was she, Victoria? Why wasn't this published? Harrison and Victoria exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. It's agency business, Harrison said finally. Nothing to do with you. The manuscript is over 30 years old. Whatever agency business it was is long past. As a literary scholar, I'm interested in recovering important works, especially by female writers. Whoa. It wasn't good enough. Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp. Robert ultimately decided it wasn't marketable. These things happen all the time in publishing. But that directly contradicted my father's notes in the margins. Every comment suggested he believed it was not just publishable but potentially landmark. I don't believe you, I said. Dad's notes say the exact opposite. Something else happened. What was it? Victoria straightened her already perfect posture. This is exactly why your father found you so difficult, Olivia. Always questioning, always challenging, never simply accepting his expertise. Elizabeth Gardner wasn't publishable. End of story. Then you won't mind if I research her further? Perhaps even prepare a scholarly edition of this manuscript. Harrison stepped forward. Actually, we would mind. Any unpublished manuscript submitted to Dad's agency remains the intellectual property of the agency unless rights were explicitly returned to the author. That manuscript belongs to us. That's not how copyright works, and you know it, I countered. The rights belong to the author, not the agent. Unless you can produce a contract saying otherwise, Elizabeth Gardner or her estate owns this work. Fine, Harrison snapped. Good luck finding her. She disappeared 30 years ago, probably dead by now. His words confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. There was much more to this story than a simple rejection. What happened to her? I pressed. Why did she disappear? Victoria's icy composure finally cracked. Enough. This is ancient history that has nothing to do with you. Return the manuscript. It belongs with Robert's professional papers. I think I'll hold on to it while I try to locate Miss Gardner or her family, I said, tucking the portfolio under my arm. As a literary scholar, I have an ethical obligation to. As Robert's wife, Victoria cut in. I'm telling you to return it now. Something in her tone, a hint of panic beneath the anger, strengthened my resolve. I'll need to make a copy first, for my research. There will be no copies, Harrison said firmly. That manuscript is never going to see the light of day. Dad made that decision 30 years ago, and we're honoring it. Why? I demanded. What possible reason could there be to suppress an extraordinary work of literature for 3 decades? The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria and Harrison exchanged another look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Victoria sighed. Robert's study. Now. Once the door was closed behind us, Victoria poured herself a generous measure of my father's expensive scotch, something I'd never seen her do before noon. Elizabeth Gardner was a pseudonym, she said after a long sip. The author's real name was Elizabeth Gardner. The name meant nothing to me. Aunt, she was your mother, Harrison said flatly. The room seemed to tilt around me. What? That's not possible. My mother was a high school English teacher. She never wrote a novel. Oh, she wrote it, Victoria said, her voice bitter. And your father was going to publish it, make her a star. He just started his agency, and this was going to be his breakthrough book. Then why wasn't it published? What happened? Victoria looked away. She left, abandoned you and Robert without a word of explanation. Just disappeared one day while he was at a publishing lunch. He came home to find you alone in your playpen and a note saying she couldn't do it anymore. This contradicted everything I thought I knew about my childhood. My father had always told me my mother died in a car accident when I was 3. That's not true, I said, my voice shaking. Dad said she died. He showed me her grave. There is a grave, Harrison acknowledged reluctantly, but she wasn't in it. Robert created that fiction to protect you, and himself. It was easier than admitting she'd walked out on both of you. My mind was reeling. So the manuscript. He suppressed it, Victoria confirmed. He was so hurt, so angry when she abandoned you both. He couldn't bear the thought of making her famous after what she'd done. So he buried the manuscript and her memory along with it. But she was my mother. Why didn't he at least tell me the truth when I was old enough to understand? By then, the story was set, Harrison said with a shrug. And after he married my mother, it seemed better to leave the past buried. I clutched the manuscript tighter. And my mother. What actually happened to her? Victoria and Harrison exchanged another glance. We don't know, Victoria admitted. Robert hired a private investigator years ago, but the trail was cold. She simply vanished. Or he told you she did, I said, pieces beginning to fit together in my mind. Just like he told me she was dead when she wasn't. I left the brownstone in a daze, the manuscript secure in my bag, my world completely upended. The mother I'd mourned might still be alive. The father I thought I knew had constructed an elaborate fiction that had shaped my entire life. And in my hands I held my mother's voice, her thoughts, her art, her extraordinary talent that had never reached the world. Back at my hotel, I examined the manuscript with new eyes. The protagonist, a young woman discovering her family's hidden history, now seemed painfully autobiographical. Had my mother been writing about her own life in some way? Were there clues in these pages that might lead me to her, if she was still alive? I began searching more thoroughly, using academic databases and resources unavailable to casual researchers. Elizabeth Garner was a common enough name, but with my university credentials, I could access records most people couldn't. 3 days later, I canceled my return to Massachusetts. My classes would have to wait. I had tracked Elizabeth Garner to a small town in northern Vermont, where a woman by that name had been teaching at a local college for the past 20 years. Her faculty photo, though showing a woman 3 decades older than my childhood memories, had my eyes. My father's jawline, my grandmother's high cheekbones. The drive to Vermont took 6 hours, each mile increasing my anxiety. What would I say to this woman who might be my mother? What could possibly explain her abandonment of a 3-year-old child? And why had my father lied so completely, creating a fictional death rather than the painful truth? The small liberal arts college where she taught was nestled among rolling hills, its campus quiet on a Sunday afternoon. Her faculty profile listed her as a professor of English literature, specializing in 19th century American women writers. Like mother, like daughter. The irony wasn't lost on me. I found her in her office, surrounded by books, grading papers much as I had been when Victoria's email arrived. The woman who looked up as I knocked on her open door had silver-streaked dark hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her eyes, my eyes, widened in shock. "Olivia," she whispered. Not a question, a recognition. "Elizabeth Garner?" I managed, though I already knew the answer. "Yes." Her hands trembled as she set down her pen. "You found me." "I found your manuscript first," I said, pulling the portfolio from my bag. "Shadows of Salem, the novel Dad refused to publish after you left." She reached for it with reverent hands. "I never thought I'd see this again. I assumed Robert had destroyed it. He kept it, hidden away with everything else about you." Her eyes filled with tears, including the truth. "Why did you leave?" The question burst from me, all my prepared speeches forgotten. "How could you abandon your child?" "I didn't abandon you," she said, her voice breaking. "Robert took you from me." And so the real story emerged, piece by painful piece. There had been no abandonment, at least not the way Victoria and Harrison had described. My parents' marriage had been unraveling for months. My father's controlling behavior, his jealousy of my mother's literary talent, his growing resentment as publishing professionals began to show more interest in her work than his fledgling agency. The final break came when he presented her with an impossible choice: give up writing or give up her family. When she refused both options, he'd locked her out of their home while she was at a meeting with another agent who had expressed interest in her manuscript. By the time she returned, my father had filed emergency custody papers, claiming she was mentally unstable and had threatened to harm herself and me. It was the 1980s, she explained, tears streaming down her face. I had no money for legal fees. Your father had powerful friends in New York. The temporary custody order became permanent. Every time I tried to fight it, he threatened to have me institutionalized. Eventually, I had to leave to rebuild some kind of life. But I never stopped trying to reach you. I never received anything from you, no letters, no calls, nothing. I sent hundreds of letters over the years, birthday cards, Christmas gifts. Robert must have intercepted them all. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a thick folder. I kept copies. I couldn't bear the thought that you might someday believe I hadn't tried. Inside were carbon copies of letters dating back to 1988, continuing all the way to my college graduation, which she'd attended from a distance, watching her daughter receive a diploma without being able to approach her. Why didn't you try to find me when I was an adult? Once I was beyond his control. I did, she said simply. 5 years ago, I wrote to you at your university. I received a cease and desist letter from Robert's attorney in response, threatening a restraining order if I made any further attempts to contact you. 5 years ago, when I'd begun my doctoral research on overlooked female writers, when my relationship with my father had deteriorated to nearly nothing, the timing couldn't be coincidental. He knew I was studying women's literature. He was afraid I might stumble onto your manuscript, make the connection. She nodded. It would have unraveled everything: his story about my death, his suppression of my work, the custody battle. Your father built his entire reputation on discovering and nurturing literary talent. Imagine the scandal if it became known that his first act as an agent was to bury what might have been a major work because of personal vengeance. I thought about the man I'd known, successful, respected, but perpetually disappointed in his academically inclined daughter who studied obscure women scribblers. Had he seen my mother in me all along? Had my choice of specialization been some unconscious attempt to find her? What happens now? I asked quietly. Elizabeth, my mother, looked down at the manuscript between us. That depends on you. I've spent 30 years believing my only child thought I was dead or had willingly abandoned her. Finding out that you're not only alive, but following a similar academic path. It's more than I ever hoped for. And the manuscript? It's extraordinary work. It deserves to be published. After all this time, she gave a sad smile. The publishing world has moved on. Historical fiction about the Salem witch trials is hardly groundbreaking anymore. But recovering a suppressed work by a female author, especially under these circumstances, that's exactly the kind of literary discovery that scholars in my field live for. I hesitated, then added, we could work on it together. A scholarly edition with an introduction explaining its history and significance. Something kindled in her eyes, hope, perhaps, or the rekindling of an old dream. You would want to do that. After everything? I've spent my career trying to ensure forgotten female voices are heard, I said. Starting with yours seems fitting. 6 months later, I stood at a podium in a crowded university auditorium, introducing the speaker for our department's distinguished literary lecture series. Beside me sat Victoria Harrison and several of my father's former colleagues, all subpoenaed to attend as part of the settlement we'd reach after the truth about my mother's manuscript came to light. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, I said to the audience of students, faculty, and literary professionals. Dr. Elizabeth Garner, whose recently recovered manuscript Shadows of Salem has been described by Publishers Weekly as a lost masterpiece of American historical fiction. Following its publication next month by Reclamation Press, Dr. Garner will be teaching a special seminar here on women's voices in early American literature. As my mother took the podium to enthusiastic applause, I caught Victoria's eye in the front row. Her face was rigid with barely contained fury, not at the humiliation of being forced to witness this triumph, but because the settlement had included financial compensation that had decimated what remained of my father's estate. Beside her, Harrison looked merely defeated. His agency was struggling in the wake of the scandal that had erupted when the story broke about how his father had suppressed a major literary work out of personal vengeance. Several clients had already left for other representation. My mother began her reading, her voice strong and clear as she shared the words she'd written 3 decades earlier, words that had been hidden away, like she had been, like the truth had been. I'd spent my career searching for lost female voices in American literature, never imagining the most significant recovery would be so deeply personal. The manuscript hadn't just restored a potentially important literary work to public view. It had restored my mother to me, and with her, a more complete understanding of my own history and identity. As I listened to her read, I reflected on how thoroughly my father had constructed the narrative of our family, deciding which voices would be heard and which would be silenced. He had been the agent in every sense of the word, controlling the story from beginning to end. But stories have a way of resisting suppression. Words find their way to the surface, like buried seeds pushing through soil toward the light. And sometimes, the most powerful literary recovery isn't found in an archive or forgotten library, but in the spaces between the stories we're told about ourselves and the truths waiting to be discovered. After the lecture, as my mother signed copies of advanced readers' editions for an enthusiastic crowd, I stood slightly apart, watching this woman who had been both stranger and ghost to me for 30 years. Victoria approached, her designer handbag clutched like armor. "You've destroyed everything your father built," she said quietly. "Was it worth it?" I considered the question carefully. Dad built his career by controlling narratives, deciding which stories deserved to be told and which didn't. I'm simply continuing the family business, but with different criteria. He protected you, she insisted. Created a story that was easier than the messy truth. He protected himself, I corrected. And in doing so, he denied me my mother and the world a remarkable literary voice. That's not protection, it's control. Victoria's gaze shifted to where my mother was engaged in animated conversation with the department chair. She abandoned both of you. Whatever Robert's faults, he was the parent who stayed. That's still his version of the story, I said. I've chosen to hear hers as well before deciding what to believe. Later that evening, over dinner with my mother in my small faculty apartment, I showed her the final cover design for our book, Shadows of Salem by Elizabeth Garner, with a critical introduction by Dr. Olivia Blackwood. The subtitle read, "A Recovered Masterpiece of American Literary History." "It's really happening," she said, tracing the cover with her fingertip. "After all these years. Not exactly how you imagined it, I'm sure." She smiled, a smile I was still getting used to seeing, still finding echoes of in my own mirror. "No, it's better. The book is important, but finding you again, that's the real recovery." We talked late into the night, continuing the process of bridging 30 years of separation. There were still gaps to fill, wounds that might never fully heal. But we had begun the work of reclamation, of her story, of our relationship, of the truth. In my field, literary recovery is painstaking work, piecing together fragments, contextualizing lost voices, bringing forgotten narratives back into the canon. I never expected to apply those same scholarly techniques to my own life, recovering not just a manuscript, but an entire history that had been deliberately obscured. As my mother prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Your father wasn't wrong about everything, you know. He always said you were stubborn, persistent, unwilling to accept simple answers. He didn't mean those as compliments." "Perhaps not," she acknowledged. "But those are precisely the qualities that led you to find me, to uncover the manuscript, to insist on the truth. Sometimes the traits parents find most challenging in their children are exactly what those children need to become their true selves." After she left, I sat at my desk, surrounded by the scholarly apparatus of our forthcoming book, footnotes, historical context, literary analysis. But my mind was on the broader implications of what we had uncovered. How many other voices had been silenced over the years? How many manuscripts lay forgotten in attics or basements, suppressed by those with the power to control which stories reached the public? And how many other families were shaped by narratives as carefully constructed as the one my father had created? I couldn't answer those questions for others, but for myself, for my mother, for the remarkable manuscript that had brought us together again. I could ensure that this particular story finally reached the audience it deserved. Sometimes the most important scholarly work begins with the most personal questions, and sometimes finding a lost manuscript leads to recovering much more than words on a page.